Welcome to Leadership and Life Chat with your hosts, me, James Lay.
And me, Mark Curtis. In each episode, we'll be illustrating how success in leadership is inextricably linked with success in life.
Whether it's leadership in business, society, family or friends, we're all leaders.
Using our experiences and a range of expert guests, we'll share secrets to boosting your health, wealth and self.
So let's get on with the show.
On this week's show, we're going to take a deep dive into language. And by language, what I'm talking about is our native tongue, English, but how we actually use it. Really taking a deep look at the words we use, James, and how we construct sentences and how it all knits together. And also how, if we're not careful, those words can have a really negative impact on ourselves and people around us. Now, the reason I want to look at this is because I've been talking to some colleagues within our business, and there's been a general feeling that maybe some of the language patterns are not being as healthy as what they used to be. And James, you and I have been asked to run a course for one of our teams. So we've put a lot of thought and planning into that course. And we thought, you know what, there's some really good stuff in there. So why don't we actually record a podcast on it? Because it's got to be relevant to everyone out there who is using the English language to a lesser or a greater degree. What do you think?
I think it's a great idea, Mark. Apologies to the listeners. We've both come down with COVID in the last week or two. I had it a lot worse than Mark, obviously, but I'm tougher than Mark and I've got through it. But we are a little bit Barry White this morning. I think language is a great topic to be talking about, Mark. Communication is what success comes down to an awful lot in leadership and in life. We've talked about things around sort of confidence and how important that is, but communication, time and again, success is driven and failure is driven through how effective we are with our communication lines. And it is language, but it's also body language as well. So there's a number of sort of angles that we can talk through in this podcast. That sounds really good.
Yeah, that's great. Brilliant. And I've had conversations with a couple of people recently, James, where I've been talking to them as well about what is going on inside their head. In terms of language, that is, you know, what is the self-talk they're using? How are they framing stuff to themselves? So I think I'd like to explore that out further today as well, because you know, once you start to become aware of some of this stuff, you can really catch yourself, whether it be internal or external communication. So we'll come on to it. Let's not give too much away. I think we really ought to start taking a deep dive into some of these points. So over to you, really, for the first deep dive point that we're going to talk around.
Cool, as they say, or they don't say anymore.
You're back on call again.
Back on call, yeah. Wicked, okay. So, sorry, I'll move on. So the first point I would focus in on, and we've devoted our whole show to this. I think it was episode 61 on neutral thinking, and it was inspired by the late Trevor Moawad, who did an awful lot of research into positive thinking, but also just re-engineering that a little bit. He was looking more at neutral thinking first. I think it's a big turn-off for people if you say to people, you know, think positively. It's as Trevor said, it's one of the sort of key sort of turn-offs for an awful lot of people in the personal development world, because it's seen as being maybe a bit glib, and it's not necessarily recognizing problems that exist for people. But his view was that actually, rather than try and sort of move from negative talking to positive talking, actually there was this sort of neutral position that people ought to be taking. You can't turn a car from reverse into forwarding without at least at some point getting it into a neutral sort of stopped point before you go in the other direction. So leaping onto this is all around neutral thinking, and one of the key aspects. Trevor Moawad was I recommend people sort of look at his work and maybe take a listen to our episode 61 on it. He was a psychologist and coach. Worked for a number of the big football teams in American football teams. And one of the things he would do when he joined a team was to try and stamp out negative talking. So recognizing that there can still be negative thinking, because I don't think we can stop negative thinking. Your brain will think these things. The difference between maybe more successful people than others on that is that they don't dwell on the negatives, but in particular, they don't talk about the negatives. And Trevor's stats that he reeled out was that a negative thought is anywhere between sort of 5 to 7 times more powerful than a positive thought. So there's this natural slant towards negatives. And if you actually verbalise a thought, you make it 10 times more powerful than if you just think it. So his argument was that you're actually sort of a negative thought is anywhere between sort of 50 and 70 times more powerful than a positive thought. If you say something out loud negatively, then it's 50 to 70 times more powerful than just thinking a positive thought. So we've got to be really, really careful around our language. And if we're having these negative thoughts, then we're entitled to have those. There's nothing wrong with that. Intrinsically, everybody has negative thoughts. But the tip is really being very selective over when you verbalise those negatives, because when you do, it has a ripple impact on everybody around you. It has, it's almost contagious. Just talking about COVID, it's almost, this negative thinking impacts everybody around you. So don't necessarily strive for positive thinking, but strive certainly in the first instance for neutral thinking and not verbalizing the bad things that you may be thinking.
Yeah, and do you know what, James? I was thinking about this as part of putting this presentation together for some of our internal teams, and I started to think about negative language in the context of alcohol and drugs, which is, I'm not. Before we go any further, I'm not condoning the use of alcohol or drugs here, but in moderation, in moderation, most things in life, they don't have a massive detrimental effect. Most things in life in moderation, and I think negative language is the same, which is if you allow it to spread and you continue to use it more and more and more, you actually become dependent on it, and you almost sort of, to use an American phrase, you almost get off on negative language. I think you can become addicted to negative language. It becomes dominant for you. So I think it can be. So in that respect, I think it's just looking out for, well, how can it manifest itself to get to that level? And some of the things I was thinking around that, James, within business or within your friend groups, some of the words which I'm sure we'll all recognise, which are sort of coming into my things like pity parties. How often do people get together and once that momentum starts to flow, it becomes all encompassing and it starts to bring on a life of its own. Gossip is another thing. How much gossip goes on amongst like work groups and friend groups, and ultimately you can start to really create a negative culture because it becomes the way things that are done. So I think some of this as well, James, is it's also recognizing the environment within our businesses, within our friends group, where this can breed, and then start to maybe take action about how we can stop becoming addicted to negative language.
And it's interesting because there's a bit of herd mentality, pack mentality with all of this. First of all, the negative thinking is understandable. Our brains, going back to our amygdala, they're wired to look out for threats. And going back to when we were in caves and things like that many years ago, there are a lot more threats out there than there perhaps are today. There are still threats, but we can easily now look out for things that are negative, which may never happen, which perhaps are being blown out of proportion and catastrophized. So we're kind of wired to do that for our self-preservation. But also, you talk about pity parties, and actually, if you're in, we have a desire to be part of a group as well from a survival perspective. Humans are designed to work together, and that's how they've survived over all the different generations. And so, speaking out, speaking differently to our pack, perhaps if they are talking negatively or they're gossiping, and not joining in on that, can actually isolate you a little bit from your group. And so again, that's against perhaps what we're programmed to do. So these things they're not necessarily wired in our favor, but trying to keep an eye out for things when maybe they're spiraling a little bit negatively, and you're verbalizing this stuff, is trying to stop it in its tracks. Pick out your own habits. I think it's very difficult to point it out with other people. But you can certainly say, look, one of the things I'm looking to do is, speak less negatively. So catch me out, please. And that's almost an indirect way of getting them to follow the lead with you. And they may say, well, do the same with me. That sounds a really good idea. So yeah, it was interesting. Those 2 points really in relation to a lot of this is down to our survival.
Yeah, but the other interesting thing, James, we've all been in meetings, in inverted commas, whatever that might mean, where it's turned incredibly negative. And when you walk out of the room, whatever that room might be, a formal meeting, an informal discussion with other people, it feels like the life has been sucked out of the room as well. You walk away and you feel nasty.
Yeah.
You don't feel nice about yourself either, do you? It's horrible. It's a horrible.
We've talked about energy vampires, haven't we? And how they focus on the negative and they need support and they'll jump at the opportunities to be part of a pity party. And you're right, it's exhausting. And you drain the energy out of the room and out of everybody else. So, we always have to decide who do we want to be in the room? Do we want to be the energy vampire or the energy giver?
Yeah, and do you know what? One of the things which years ago, James, we used in our business was that there's a guy, Edward de Bono, and one of his books was de Bono's hats, where he uses the 6 hat system, and each hat. So it was all about how you manage a meeting in a room, because so for example, and we'll put a link in the show notes to the book. I think it's still a really effective way to run a meeting if you've got issues around negativity in rooms. So one of the hats, for example, is a red hat. Red hat is about emotion. You're allowed to give your emotional response to the situation in the meeting. There's a black hat, which is a negative thought hat. There's a green hat, which is a green shoots new ideas. So you've got these 6 different color hats which represent different things. And what you can do is so because you don't want to stop people saying something negative, because that negative could be important. It could be something which is going to stop you doing something really silly or dangerous in your business. So this is not about negative is always bad. But the way it used to work in the meetings, if you wanted to wear your black hat and be negative about something, from memory, I think it was then you had to use your green hat to then promote a positive idea off the back of it, something which could then make a positive difference. So something like that can really manage the room rather than it spiraling in one direction or another. It allows people who are naturally more maybe sort of negative about things to get their point across as well, but it can still be done in a constructive way. And something like that for me could be really massive for businesses if they've got a negative culture starting to form in pity party meetings. Use something like de Bono's hat system to bring it to life. And when it first came into our business, there was literally a bag which got brought into partners meetings, which had the different sorts of hats which were in the right color. And you physically put the hat on when you did it, just to kind of make it a little bit more fun. Wild. I
baseball
know,
caps
as accountants, well, there was like peak caps and trilbies and all sorts. It was a whole mix
different
of hats.
styles. Okay.
Wild accounting partners meetings. That's what these were, James. But it did bring it to life, and people engaged in the process. So that's something I think is which we could do if we find that we've got any sort of negativity building in meetings. Let's try something different to rebalance the meetings.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about everyone being sort of Pollyannas here and trying to make everything sound, perfect, everything else. But I think it's an awareness point as much as anything else, and just knowledge that if you say something negative, it is powerful. It's more powerful than positive thoughts. So by some margin, and so just being selective over when you say these things, and having. Maybe there is a negative aspect to it, but maybe there's a solution that can be thrown in the mix at the same time. So I love that, Mark. So just trying to be constructive.
And maybe, James, one of the things to get a musical link in here, because I'm conscious we haven't got one in on today's show yet. If you haven't got anything nice to say, don't say it at all. So that's going to take us into don't speak, by No Doubt. Gwen Stefani.
Gwen Stefani. Yeah, that came on the radio with one of my children in the car, 15-year-old. No idea who Gwen Stefani was, but then I guess there's no reason why she would. But
So moving on to a second point, James, we refer back to our NLP training and qualification quite a bit in this show, and I'm going to take it there for the second point. And one of the things which we studied as part of our NLP qualification was very much around the nuances of language. So at the outset, I kind of said about being really mindful and careful of the actual words we use and how we construct the sentences together. Because I think at school, in the education system, we're very much taught words. So you know several hundred or thousand, or I think the average person knows, is it 13,000 words or something? I can't remember. But we're not necessarily taught the importance of putting them together only in a grammatic sense. We're only taught grammatically how to construct a sentence, but not the impact that those words are necessarily going to have. So where I want to go with this is maybe some of the patterns. So this is about patterns of words. I suspect is what we're really going to get into. So some of the things I'd maybe like to just dive into, James. Some of the things we should be looking out for, what we say to ourselves and what we say to other people, or just spotting what other people are saying as well. So, James, the way I'd like to take this is actually just pull some specifics out, just to give the listeners a feel for the language patterns that that could be circulating around, and then we can give an example of how you could maybe challenge back on that, or maybe you could reframe it to yourself. So if I'm just going to pick the first one, which is what is classed as normalization. So you normalize the language. So, for example, we lack communication would be a generic comment which someone could easily throw out there to make, which could be deemed as a negative comment, if you like. We just lack communication. And what would you say to that?
Yeah, and I guess the first question would be, well, who's we? Like, who is it that's not communicating? It's I mean, it's a bit of a generalization. And it's just the sort of thing that might be thrown around in a pity party. We're not communicating, or we lack communication. But it also doesn't sort of draw out, well, what does good communication look like? We lack communication. It doesn't really. It's only 3 words, so you have to be slightly careful. But in the context, but. It's just very unspecific. It's very generalized, and it applies to everybody across the board. Which, there's an awful lot more detail you could drive into off the back of that comment, but it's very easily accepted.
Yeah, and it could really steer the conversation, can't it? Because if other people are going, yeah, that's right, we just lack communication, and then that whole kind of spiral of pity party goes about. If someone if someone interjects as you did in that example we gave there, James, which is almost saying, well, so who's not communicating, and how would you like to communicate? And you start to kind of just maybe ask a few questions and pose around it that way. Then all of a sudden you can completely shift the momentum of where that conversation could go. It could spiral down into a real negative pity party, or actually other people when you're going, oh, yeah, so who doesn't? Oh, it's someone specific in the team. Cool. Okay, what can we do about it? Do they need to go on a training course? And you can suddenly completely change the momentum of that conversation.
Yeah, I do hear at times comments around sort of like, there's quite a few in the team that think ... And actually, sometimes you just have to. It's implied that it's the majority, and actually, fully well that person's probably only spoken to 2 or 3 members of the team, and then they've taken a leap from that point onwards in terms of the generalized view. Sometimes you have to get it into the detail. So, who specifically have you spoken to? What exactly did they say? In what ways are we lacking communication?
Yeah,
drive into the detail. So another example would be what we call cause and effect. So you might say something along the lines of, they make me angry.
Yeah, that's always a really interesting one, isn't it, James? Because I think there's two things to this. The first one is, well, you're going to say, well, how do they make you angry? But then more specifically, you'd say, well, why do you choose to feel angry about this? And this comes back to our locus of control episode, episode 1 of Leadership and Life Chat. So that in that example, that you've given away control, you're blaming someone else for how you feel. So there's definitely the challenge back about, well, why do you choose to feel angry? But there's definitely the how does it make you feel angry as well. So that, you know, I would definitely be just asking those questions, and they're not confrontational questions. They're just trying to elicit out what the person really means, what's really going on behind the language, because the language is hiding a multitude of sins. We want to find out what the language really means. I think one of my favourites, James, is the mind read, and we all do it. So, for example, I know the team are all stressed.
Yeah. How do you know that? Have they actually all told you that, or is it? Have you tried to read some body language, or is there an element of bias in there because you're stressed and you want everyone else to feel stressed, because that way, you know, you feel slightly better about yourself because you're not coping with your workload, whereas perhaps others are. So that happens time and again. Mind reads, and how often do we get mind reads completely and utterly wrong? You know, perhaps we're speaking with somebody and they seem a bit distant or perhaps even rude, and we think that we've upset them, and actually they've got their mind on something else. There's a personal problem that they're working through. They're distracted, whatever it might be, and it happens a lot in the written form in terms of messages and texts and things, where, you know, the absence of, you know, words or the inclusion of words can just give the wrong impression. But all we've done is interpreted the information. This is all we're doing at any given time with communication. We're interpreting, we're trying to apply a meaning to it. And often that mind read can be completely out of kilter. Sometimes it's right and our gut instincts are absolutely spot on. But if we can't rely upon our mind reads to be 100% accurate all the time, and we have to challenge other people when we can quite clearly see that they've jumped to a mind read with a certain statement like that.
As you said, James, it very often can be reflective of how that person's feeling. So how they're interpreting a situation. The only person who's not like that is my current favourite series on Amazon Prime, which is The Mentalist. I'm heavily into that series now. Honestly, you've got to watch it. He reads people. He's kind of like, it's absolutely phenomenal series. But he reads
a documentary.
No. It's a fictional thing, but it's fantastic because he.
Right. Okay.
So if you look up the definition
really
of a mentalist, so producer Lizzie, can we put the definition of a mentalist in the show, please? But it's basically someone who's got real sensory acuity. You know, they're really reading other people's like processes through their body language and stuff. Yeah, really interesting. So cool. So unless you're Patrick Jane. You're probably not going to. A lot of the stuff's going to be mind reads for most of us because we're just not.
My favourite program at the moment. My favourite program at the moment is The Detectorist, which is a bit like The Mentalist, isn't it? But have you seen The Detectorist?
No,
it's fantastic.
Is that about metal detecting?
It is. Yeah.
I've got
it's a comedy. It's just a chilled out, nice comedy available on the BBC iPlayer. Should people be interested? Shall we move on?
We shall. Should we do? Let's just do one more, James, because we could go on for all day on this. Let's just pick out one more your favourite from NLP language patterns.
Universal quantifiers. I love those. You know, where, you know, we'll throw a statement out and it will be, so I don't know, something like everything is a disaster. When we're really at a peak of negativity.
Yeah.
Everything's a disaster.
Yeah. And that's just such a great one, isn't it? And this is something I use all the while as a retort back to people, which is, so everything's a disaster. What specifically is a disaster?
And people will try and defend it for a while. Yeah, everything.
Yeah,
you know, everything.
Yeah.
And then
and a common one is, I'm just rubbish at everything as well. I'm just rubbish. What, you rubbish at everything?
Nobody likes me. It's what you say quite a lot, Mark, isn't it? It's not true.
Yeah.
Some people do. I don't know who they are. But
we have discussed this before, about whether my mum likes me or not, and we're still not sure on that one either. But it's just these big all-inclusive, and when it becomes big like that, you just feel even worse. So if you can get people to, you know, like come out of overwhelm and get it down into a few specifics, it just tends to bring people back down a little bit as well. So
catastrophization of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it often happens, and people talk about they've had a bad day. I had a terrible day yesterday. Actually, there's one thing in that day that didn't go according to plan. That may have lasted 10 minutes. The other 23 hours and 50 minutes might have gone perfectly according to plan. You know, lots of good stuff in there, yet we bang a label on it and we call it, you know, it was a bad day. But often it was just one thing that didn't go right. It could be an important thing, but is that necessarily, we talk about these universal quantifiers, is it really accurate to be applying that? Because we go back to that negativity and the power of that. When you start saying these things, then you start, we also talk about reticular activating system quite a lot, Mark, don't we? This RAS system, which is the way we filter things. And if you keep labeling things negatively, then your brain listens out for this stuff and it looks for more. Yeah. So, you can spin this on its head. And if you're verbalizing positive things and you're focusing on positive things, then your brain, your reticular activating system, will go and find more of it. You attract more of it. So,
I mean, there's so much more we could have covered in this section, James. But hopefully, what we've done is we've really brought to light to the listeners, which is just be so self-aware of the actual words, what the meaning of the words are which are being said. Not just does the sentence make grammatical sense. What is the actual impact of those words on yourself, because you're hearing what you say, but also others, and so my top tip coming out of this section is just self-awareness. Just really be self-aware of the language that you're using, but also then awareness of the language that other people are using, and really really look out and listen out for those key words, or more importantly, the words that are not there. What is being missed out as well? That is just, for me, that is massive in terms of how we deal with language and use language more eloquently and more effectively.
Love it. Okay, should we move on to tip number 3?
Yep, go for it.
Which is me. And we've talked a lot around selection. Tip number 1 was around sort of selection of what we say. Not ruling out negative thinking, but being selective over what we verbalize. Tip number 2 is more around the words that we use, and being mindful of the universal quantifiers that we're talking about, the mind reads and the normalization, those types of things. I think moving on to tip number 3, words are important in our communication, but also just making sure that we look at the bigger picture. So in any communication, words make up around 8% of the effectiveness of the communication. So words are crucially important. Say the wrong words in the wrong order, and it does have an impact on the effectiveness of your communication. Clearly, words are really important, but it is only a small aspect of our overall communication skills. So out of that communication, 38% of the effectiveness is down to the tone that we use. We can come on to an example of that maybe in a bit, Mark. But 55%, the balancing 55% is the physiology. So, the way that we present our bodies when we're talking, and whether that aligns with the tone, whether that aligns with the words that we use. And alignment is the big thing, because we can say things, the words, but yet our tone and our physiology can be completely different. And, we see this with children, don't we, where they will apologize, and you can see quite clearly they are not apologizing. They are not sorry. It's not actually just children. This is adults as well. They're not sorry. They've said the word sorry, so therefore they've ticked a box, sorry. That is quite different, with arms crossed in that sort of sarcastic, unapologetic tone, is quite different from a heartfelt apology that we might give where we really mean it. So, we say an awful lot of things like, I really like you, Mark, to I really like Mark, these types of things, and the way we express them, I think is very easy for us to, like those examples are blown out of proportion a bit to kind of underline the point. But we do have to remember that if we're trying to inspire people, for instance, then, and we write a short speech, the words are going to be really important, but actually people are going to need to tie that in with your tone and your body language. That's how you get the real effectiveness across. So you can say what you like, but if it seems like you don't mean it and it doesn't align with, your body, then it won't be effective. People dial out of the words, just as Mark is doing now with what I'm saying. People dial out of what you're saying, and they remember how you make them feel. And a lot of that isn't in the words that you say. So those
That's
stats, I think, are really stark. I don't know where they come from. It's standard NLP stats that we trot out all the time. But think about this, everyone. Like 8% is the words that we say, and 38% is the tone, and 55% is the body language. And then try and think of the scenarios in which you're communicating. Because actually, if it's in maybe text, maybe you don't get a chance to present this, then the words are really important. The way they're constructed is really important. But you also can't allow people to go off on mind reads, as we were talking about earlier. It has to be all joined up. And ultimately, how do you make the person that you're communicating with, how do you make them feel with the words that you're saying?
And it reminds me, Jordan Belfort, the Real Wolf of Wall Street. I was on an online session which he was presenting once, where he was talking about this, and he said words might only make up 7 or 8% of overall communication, but the words you use matter 100%. And this comes back to the second point we were talking about, which is be really, really careful, as you were saying there, of the words you use, because they only make 7%, but they 100% matter if you get them wrong. So you've got to get the right words as well. So I think what you're saying here, James, is it's more than words. Extreme.
Oh, that song?
Look at that.
That's a song, isn't it?
Brilliant. How good was that?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So there's my second musical link today. But you're right, because how often have you been to, I don't know, we covered presentation skills and public speaking in Leadership in Life episode 2 with Andrew Brammer. How many times have you ever been to an event, James, where someone's come onto the platform and said, "Oh, we're really pleased to have you here today," because they're uncomfortable about standing up there. You've gone to another one. I don't know. Again, probably when I went and saw Jordan Belfort down at the XL in London, it's sort of like he came like bouncing on the stage, like, it's great to be here today. It's great to have you all here today, and it's like just completely different experience. So you're right. We naturally read this stuff. We know when someone's being sincere, if they're being congruent between the words, the tone, the physiology, and if they're not, we pick up on that. We know that, and then we're probably thinking, I'm not sure if I trust this person, because it starts to erode trust as well.
But on those speeches where you get the monotone speeches, where they're very crafted very deliberately, and everyone has an element of nerves when they're speaking and those sorts of things, so you have to sort of get over that. But often the focus is too much on the words and getting them out accurately, and I think sometimes the focus needs to be, as a speaker, and I know Andrew Brammer talked about this, but it needs to be in terms of sharing value with the listener. Like, that needs to be your focus. And that isn't just the words. The words are important, but that isn't just the words. And there are an awful lot of fantastic communicators out there that aren't the brightest, perhaps have that level of confidence we've talked about in previous episodes, and they've had the people, they've had the public speaking skills that Andrew talked about. But it isn't necessary in the script. It's the way it's delivered.
Do you know what?
And it's just
the really interesting thing,
original.
The really interesting thing, which I'm just thinking about here, James, is part of NLP training is about hypnosis. And when you hypnotize somebody, you have to speak in a level tone and a level pace of speaking. So the
trying
idea,
to relax them.
The idea being you're trying to kind of put them into a trance. So just thinking then about communication, if you're monotone and you're banging it out at a steady pace as you're talking, you're going to send the person to sleep, basically.
Yeah.
So that's how you hypnotize someone. Most of the time when we're talking to people, we don't want to hypnotize them. Therefore, the tone, the pace, all of that is really important to engage around the words as well. Otherwise, we can send people to sleep quite quickly.
It is, but and again, in NLP terms, we talk about building rapport, and one of the ways to do that, if it's not a public speech, I think if you're doing a speech to a group of people, then it needs to be engaging. You need to be natural, but there needs to be an element of energy that you bring to the room at the same time. It needs to be engaging, doesn't it? I think you can take a more chameleon-like approach when you're having one-to-one discussions with people. We talk about rapport building. One of the ways you do that is what we call mirroring and matching. And one particular way of doing that is trying to align your tone, your timbre. I like saying the word timbre, although I'm never really sure what it means. But the words that you use with the other person, and you're trying to get some congruence between the two of you. So you're almost trying to actually mirror the same breathing patterns of the other person, so that if they are upbeat, actually most upbeat people, they want to talk with other upbeat people. They don't want to speak with people that take their time. They lose patience with them. So, you need to up it a level. Likewise, if you're dealing with people that are more, sort of a slower talkers, then you need to slow your own communication down as well to mirror and match them. And that can help build rapport as well. So it's sometimes, it's not being a bull in a china shop and just applying your style across the board to everybody. Sometimes if you're looking to build rapport and get your message across, then it's a case of looking out for how they communicate and trying to match them.
Great point. What this demonstrates to me is just how wide a topic language actually is. It's a single word which we all go, yeah, we know what language means. Once you start really diving into it, I mean, we have covered a whole range of things today, James, and it just shows how wide the topic of language really is. And I think what this shows to me is this show was very much around today, James, being more aware of our language and the fact that we take language for granted, and most of us, a lot of the time, not always, I won't say always, a lot of the time, we're quite sloppy with our language because we just speak. We don't really think about the impact of the words. And I think the bit we've been talking about there, Lizzie, is a lot of this is sloppy language. So it all comes back to the square root of this show, which is about how do we become more aware of our language and how do we upgrade our language. That was very much what we wanted to get across out of this show today. So just to recap on the sort of the crux of the 3 points that we were talking around today, and the sort of the main areas coming out of that. The first one was it was about negative language, but it was also about spotting how it can turn into pity parties, and then what we can do to maybe redress the balance within the language that is being used. The second point we then went on to was more specifically the language patterns that we use and things that are unsaid and what maybe is hidden behind what people are saying, and we have to try and elicit that out. So we gave some specific examples there. So if you want to go back on that, take a listen to some of those specifics again. And the third one, James, was your point around non-verbal communication. So it's very much around the tone and the body language, the physiology as well. So language is not just about words; it's much wider than that. So I think there's 3 areas which we can all focus onto there. We can all do something about it. We can all upgrade our language. And I think if we start using better language, we're going to get better results because people will interact differently with us. So as leaders in business and in life, upgrading our language, I think, is a cheap fix for a lot of miscommunication we have with loved ones and colleagues around us. So that's it for this week's show. That just leaves us to say, if you've got any thoughts or comments or questions about today's show, please leave a voice note. The link is in the show notes, together with all of the other things we've talked about today, the books, the references. Take a look in the show notes and follow those links. If you enjoyed today's show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple and Spotify. It really does help other people find this show. And finally, a massive thank you to our sponsors, Larking and Gowen, without whom the show wouldn't be possible. Check out the link to see how their team of experts can help you in your business. So James, thank you for today's show. Really, really enjoyed talking to you and exploring language.
It's good fun.
It was, yeah. And you can have good fun with language as well. So we hope the listeners are going to take this away and start playing with language patterns themselves. But until next week, thanks everybody.
Hi everyone, producer Lizzie here, just to remind you that Leadership and Life Chat will be taking a short summer break and hopefully we'll be back in your ears sometime late August or early September. We're not absolutely sure just yet, but make sure you hit that follow button on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever else you get your podcasts, so you don't miss out on the first episode of season 2 that will drop into your feeds around that time. We've got some really fantastic guests booked in and some great deep dive subjects lined up as well. So make sure you don't miss out. Click that follow button, and if you could give us a review or like us, that really, really appreciated. Have a great summer everybody, and we'll be back soon.